Almost 6 months ago, Pope Benedict gave us his latest encyclical in continuity with both his Deus Caritas Est and Spe Salvi, but this time focusing on integral human development, Caritas in Veritate. The Pope wanted to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the great encyclical of Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, on the development of peoples. However, the encyclical had to be published a bit belatedly because the Pope wanted to take into consideration the financial crisis which has taken over us, at least most of us, not all those not the experts. The experts seem to have known about it. But most of us were taken by surprise. But we all know that it was the result of greed. Populorum Progressio has shown that the Church's deepest interest and concern is particularly felt in the case of those peoples who are trying to escape the ravages of hunger, poverty, endemic disease, and ignorance. Of those who are seeking a larger share in the benefits of civilization and a more active involvement and improvement in their qualities of life. And for those striving even for a fuller and a better quality of life. The situation of poverty was laid bare by the financial crisis, both at the individual level and at the level of nation-states. Since the Second Vatican Council, the Church, with clear awareness, judges it her duty to help all men explore these serious problems in all their dimensions and to impress on them the need for a concerted action. Much has already been written about Caritas in Veritate since its publication last June. It is not strange that much discussion has centered on the very first sentence of the encyclical, namely that charity in truth is the principal driving force between authentic development of every human person and of all humanity. Pope Benedict stresses that Christian love is not a sentiment devoid of action. Only in truth does charity shines forth. However, the central point, which is often one of the central points which are often ignored in this encyclical, is that human development is a relational good, a concept about which Prfoessor Zamagni has spoken to us about some 4 or 5 years ago when he was here in Malta. And this relational good is born out of what the Pope calls dialogos, dialogue both with God and with fellow human beings. So today we feel very honored to have with us Prfoessor Zamagni, who, if he is not the ghostwriter of the encyclical, he was definitely one of the main collaborators of Pope Benedict in the drafting of this encyclical. When Caritas in Veritate, in fact, was released on midday, June the 7th, last year, in the presence of Cardinal Rato Martini and Bishop Crapaldi, Prfoessor Zamagni during a press conference, gave a talk on this encyclical. The timing of the encyclical's publication wasn't in no way incidental. It was published one day before the G8 had its meeting in L'Aquila in Italy. Neither is our conference timing incidental. In a day's time, we'll have His Holiness visiting our island. Hence, it is my great honor to invite Prfoessor Zamagni to speak to us on today's topic, Caritas in Veritate, Fraternity, Reciprocity, and New Economic Problems. Prfoessor Zamagni.
Thank you. Let me express sincere gratitude to Father Joe and to the Institute, Discern, for having invited me to be with you in this occasion. As you know, this is the third time that I'm in Malta, and every time I happen to meet new faces, to see again old faces, and that it's always a reason of joy for me. As far as my family condition is concerned, since the first time the family has grown, because now we have 4 grandchildren, And when they came here the first time, I had only one grandchild. Now we have 4 grandchildren, so we are progressive, etc. And that it's part of, I'm very, very proud. We are very proud for that. Now, let me start this presentation, which will be followed by, I believe, as it is common, by a discussion, by debate, whatever you want to call. So please do not hesitate later to raise any type of question you might consider is of relevance to your interest. Let me start from a question of fact. I got back last Monday, 3 days ago, from the United States, where at the University of Princeton, I took part to a conference organized by that university, which is the 3rd most important university in the United States, a 3-day conference dedicated to Caritas in Veritate. I was very surprised, because never in the past something like that occurred. Next month, the same thing will happen in Chicago University. And it was organized not by Catholic. And in fact, the membership of Catholic was very modest. But there were people, scholars from different fields, economists, sociologists, lawyers, philosophers, etc., belonging to different churches. And the same applies to countries like England, London, for instance, Cambridge. Cambridge, UK, is dedicating a conference, etc. Not to mention Italy, of course, and Spain. Now, the question is, why is it so? Why this encyclica, Caritas in Veritate, is attracting such a huge interest? I said interest. It is true that there are some voices which speak in a critical way, but that is not important. The important point is that most people are taking this document seriously, even though the vast majority of the comments are positive. So I repeat, why nothing like that occurred in the past? Take Centesimus Annus by John Paul II, which was an important encyclica, but that was not the case. In my country, which is Italy, for 4 months, this encyclica was the #1 in the ranking of the most sold books in a particular section. Nothing like that occurred in the past. Now, the answer I give to this question is because in this encyclica we find a thorough analysis of the major problems of our societies nowadays. In other words, the fact is that we live in an epoch of what we call paradoxes. You know, the word paradox comes from Greek, and in the Old Greek language, paradox means surprise, something which we do not expect and which happens. So what does it mean that we live in an epoch of paradoxes? Let me mention a few of these paradoxes. The first paradox is the fact that our societies, our economic systems, are such that wealth and income is increasing year after year. But at the same time, inequalities, which means distance between social groups, are increasing more than in proportion. And that is a paradox. It's a surprise, because in the past we were brought to believe that inequalities or relative poor people existed because of the incapability of the system to produce enough. Now, the opposite is true. Our systems are very good in producing, perhaps even too much. Consider, for instance, food. As you know, we destroy, at the world level, thousands of tons of grain, rice, etc., and still there are people who suffer. I'm not saying sometimes they are starving, but they suffer undernutrition, bad nutrition, etc. And that is a paradox. In other words, our systems are good in generating new wealth, but are very bad in distributing it among social groups or among nations. A second paradox is the fact that the so-called democratic participation in our societies is declining. Why is that a paradox? Because we live in the epoch of the third industrial revolution, namely of the new technologies. And as we know, the new technologies, they allow people to interact in a way which never was the same in the past. It is so easy today to interact among ourselves. So one would expect, rationally speaking, that the democratic participation were higher. The opposite is true. Look what happens to the participation rate to the election, or more generally, speaking more generally, the participation to the democratic life. And that is a paradox, because in the past people said people do not participate because they are illiterate. They cannot read, they cannot write, they cannot communicate. Today, no illiteracy, at least in the Western world, and still in the Western world, the democratic participation is declining year after year. And that is a paradox. Finally, let me mention a third paradox, which is very intriguing, very intriguing. It is the so-called happiness paradox. Now, as you know, the happiness paradox was discovered for the first time by an American economist, Richard Easterlin, in 1974. What does it say? It says the following, that beyond a certain threshold, income per capita, further increments in income per capita, instead of increasing the happiness index of the public happiness, reduces it. The curve is downward sloping. Now, you might ask me, how do we measure public happiness? Nowadays, all the countries in the world, Malta included, generates on a yearly basis statistics measuring the happiness index, which is determined, the index, by conflating a certain number of parameters, such as the rate of suicides. You know, the rate of suicides in our society is increasing year after year. In the European Union, I do not want to give you data because they are really frustrating. Second, consider the rate, for instance, of diseases such as depression. Today, everybody is depressed. In the past, depression did not exist. Consider the consumption of drugs of one type or the other. Consider the rate of divorces. If a couple is happy, they do not divorce. If the rate of divorces in our families is increasing, that is a sign that something is going wrong, etc., etc. Then there are parameters obtained via questionnaire using particular techniques. So by aggregating all these parameters, our statistical offices produce the so-called public happiness index. Coming back to the paradox says that beyond a certain threshold, which is 32,000 euro per year per capita, 32,000 euro per year per capita, further increments of income per capita, instead of increasing the happiness index, decreases, which is the phenomenon which is otherwise. In general, who commits a suicide? Poor people never commit suicide. Because poor people hope. They hope that the future will be better than the present. And so they have a reason to live. Who commits a suicide is somebody who has no reason to live, has lost any reason to live. That is why this paradox is intriguing, as I said. Why? Because it's delegitimizing, from a social point of view, our model of growth